that you are able, carrier of blood.
When the Duskbloods was first revealed during the Nintendo Switch 2 showcase, I think a lot of us had the exact same reaction. We saw gothic architecture, ruined streets, old-ass firearms, really quick movement, and a dark atmosphere, and for a few seconds it almost felt like FromSoftware had finally made another Bloodborne. Then the more footage started coming out, the stranger this game became. Instead of another single-player action RPG, we found out this is built around 8-player PvPvE matches, where every player enters the world as a Bloodsworn, each with their own abilities, objectives, and ways to earn victory points. They have AI enemies roaming the map and powerful bosses to fight, other players trying to hunt you down, and dynamic events that completely change how a match plays out before anyone reaches the end. That's a pretty big shift for a studio that built its reputation on lonely adventures where every victory felt like something you earned by yourself. The funny thing is, the more I looked into Duskbloods, the less I've been thinking about Bloodborne at all. I mean, it's got the looks, but I've been trying to figure out why FromSoftware decided this was the game they wanted to make next. Then the network test details dropped, and I think they answered a lot more than people realize. They didn't just tell us when we'll be able to play, they also gave us a much clearer picture of what the developers are trying to achieve with this project. At first glance, the structure sounds pretty straightforward. Up to 8 players enter a match as a Bloodsworn, exploring the same map while completing objectives, fighting monsters, and trying to survive long enough to leave with the highest number of victory points. The interesting part is how many different ways there are to reach that goal. You can spend your time hunting powerful AI enemies for rewards, or take on roaming bosses that appear during the match, or decide another player is carrying enough points to be worth the risk. On top of that, FromSoftware has introduced dynamic world events that can change what's happening across the map while the match is still in progress. One event might increase the danger in certain areas, while another could suddenly create an opportunity that wasn't there a minute ago. The Bloodsworn themselves look just as varied. Some lean into aggressive melee combat, others make much heavier use of firearms, mobility, or unique abilities, so picking a character isn't just choosing a weapon. It changes how you approach the entire match. One player might spend most of the time looking for fights, I know I most likely will, while someone else waits for the perfect moment to jump into a battle that's already happening. What surprised me most is that winning doesn't seem to come down to simply eliminating everyone else. Those aforementioned victory points can be earned through different actions, which means paying attention to what's happening around the map is probably going to matter just as much as being good at combat. I think that's where a lot of people are still picturing this as another Souls game, when FromSoft seems to be aiming for something that rewards adapting as much as skill. The funny part is that while this feels like a huge change on paper, the more I thought about it, the more I realized FromSoft has actually been building towards something like this for years. The pieces have always been there, they've just never been the main focus until now. The idea feels new because it's the first time FromSoft has built an entire game around player interaction. But those same interactions have been part of their games for well over a decade. Think back to the first time another player invaded your world in Dark Souls. You could be making your way through an area you've almost cleared and feeling pretty confident. And then suddenly everything changes because another person appears. You have to change your route, the enemies become part of the fight, and every decision matters because you're no longer dealing with something so predictable. The same thing happened with co-op summons. Sometimes you'd call someone in for a difficult boss and finish the fight, and you'd probably never speak to that person again. Other times you spend half an hour clearing an entire level together before one of you disappeared back to your own world. Even something as simple as bloodstains and player messages added another layer to exploration. You weren't completely alone even if you never spoke to another player. But those systems are always optional. You could ignore invasions by playing offline, summon help only when you wanted to, or finish the entire game without touching multiplayer. Duskbloods feels like the first time FromSoftware has taken all of those ideas and asked what would happen if they became the entire experience instead of sitting in the background. That's probably why I stopped looking at this as another Souls game. The combat still looks familiar, but the way matches unfold depends just as much on the people sharing the world with you as it does on the enemies that developers place there. That also explains why this network test feels so important. They're not just checking whether the servers stay online, they're trying to see what happens when thousands of players start making decisions that developers can't predict. Registration for the network test is already open, and if you're planning to take part, you've got until July 28th to put your name in. That's tomorrow morning. FromSoft will then select some participants before sending out download instructions, with the test itself taking place across several scheduled sessions at the end of August. Normally, I just mention the dates and move on, but I think this test tells us something much more interesting than when people get to play. A game like Elden Ring can be tested in fairly straightforward ways because most of the experience is already under the developer's control. Duskbloods doesn't have that luxury. The moment you introduce 8 real players into the same match, every encounter starts changing in ways you simply can't simulate inside the studio. Maybe everyone rushes the same boss as soon as the match starts, maybe half the lobby ignores combat altogether and focuses on farming victory points somewhere else. Maybe one Bloodsworn ability ends up being far stronger than expected because thousands of players discover combinations that developers never considered. Those are the kinds of things a closed network test is built to uncover. I'm also interested to see how people approach the objectives once they understand the scoring system. FromSoft has already confirmed that victory points aren't earned from a single activity, so I wouldn't be surprised if players spend the first few sessions experimenting to figure out what's actually worth their time. Some people will probably chase every fight they can find, while others might avoid conflict altogether until the last few minutes of a match if they think it gives them a better chance of winning. That's the part I'm looking forward to the most. Within a few hours of the test going live, the community will probably start discovering strategies that nobody had even thought about when the game was first announced. And once that starts happening, we'll have a much better idea of whether Duskbloods has a depth to keep people coming back long after the first week. As interested as I am in Duskbloods, there are still a few things I'm wanting to see before I decide whether this is something I'll be playing for months or just a few weekends. FromSoft has already confirmed there'll be more than a dozen playable characters, each with their own weapons, abilities, and passive traits. Some seem built around getting into your face with melee weapons, while others rely much more on mobility, firearms, or supporting themselves in different ways. Heck, they even have that guy that kind of looks like Bender from Futurama flying around. On paper, that's great because it should make every match feel a little different depending on who you're up against. But it's also where things can get messy if one or two characters end up clearly outperforming the rest. I'm also curious about how progression is going to work once people have hundreds of matches under their belt. Right now, we know you'll unlock cosmetics, customize your Bloodsworn, and build out different playstyles, but I hope the progression stays focused on giving players more options instead of simply making them stronger. One of the reasons FromSoft's games have such a long lifespan is because when you lose, you usually feel like it was your fault. I'd like Duskbloods to keep that feeling instead of making victories come down to who has spent the most time grinding. Then there's the matchmaking itself. FromSoft has always attracted players with completely different skill levels. Some people jump into these games looking for a challenge, others spend thousands of hours mastering every mechanic they can find. Bringing all those players together inside the same PvPvE environment is probably one of the hardest things the studio has ever attempted. If experienced players end up steamrolling every lobby, newer players won't stick around for very long. On the other hand, if everything gets flattened out too much in the name of balance, you lose some of the excitement that makes From's games so memorable in the first place. Those are exactly the kinds of things the network test should start answering. Even if we don't get every answer straight away, watching thousands of people throw themselves into this game for the first time is probably going to tell us a lot more about where the game is heading over the next few years. And looking at how FromSoft has supported its games in the past, I don't think the network test is just about launch. I think it's just the beginning, because if the game finds an audience, I have a hard time believing FromSoft is going to leave it exactly as it is after release. Although they did kind of abandon Night Rain, now that I think about it. But this structure almost feels built for post-launch updates. Adding another Bloodsworn with a different set of abilities changes how every match plays out, so introducing a new map or another dynamic world event doesn't just give players somewhere new to fight, it can also change the decisions everyone makes from the moment the match begins, because suddenly there are new routes, new objectives, and new risks to think about. I also wouldn't be surprised if the community ends up shaping the game just as much as the devs do. FromSoft release eventually reaches a point where players start discovering things nobody expected. Someone figures out a weapon combination that looks terrible on paper but ends up dominating PvP, or speedrunners begin breaking the game apart in ways the rest of us never imagined. Challenge runs appear to make everyone else question their sanity. Those moments have always been part of the fun. And Duskbloods feels like the game that's going to create even more of them, because every match is filled with real players making unpredictable decisions. What I'm most interested in, though, is seeing whether people eventually stop comparing it to Bloodborne altogether. Right now, almost every conversation starts with that comparison because it's the easiest reference point. I have a feeling that changes once people spend enough time with the game. If it succeeds, I don't think people will be talking about what it reminds them of. They'll be talking about that one match where everything somehow came together, or that last-minute fight that completely changed the leaderboard, or the boss they barely managed to bring down while another team was closing in. Those are the kinds of stories that keep multiplayer alive for years. And if FromSoft can create enough moments like that, this could end up being one of the most interesting games they've ever made. That also brings me back to the question I had when this game was first revealed, because after everything we've seen so far, I think I finally have an answer. Looking back, I think the comparison with Bloodsworn happened because it was the easiest one to make after the first trailer. Gothic setting with firearms and fast movements, in a dark atmosphere were enough for people to jump to conclusions before we knew what the game actually was. Now that we've seen a little bit of gameplay, the Bloodsworn, the victory point system, the world events, and how these matches are meant to unfold, I think it deserves to be judged on its own ideas instead of the ones people expected it to have. That doesn't mean every concern has disappeared. Balancing more than a dozen playable Bloodsworn isn't going to be easy. Keeping 8-player matches interesting hundreds of hours later won't be easy either. Those are the kinds of challenges we'll start getting answers to once the test begins. And like I said, what excites me the most is seeing how people with different skill levels take the game on and find all the crazy different builds that they could have. I also think this is one of the biggest risks the studio has taken in a long time. Making another single-player Souls would have been the safe option because everyone already knows what that looks like. Building something completely new means there's a chance some fans won't connect with it at all. At the same time, if they manage to pull this off, Duskbloods could end up creating its own community instead of living in Bloodborne's shadow. For me though, that's become the most interesting part of this whole project. I started out wondering why FromSoft would make a game like this, particularly on the Switch too. Now I'm much more interested in seeing whether the gamble pays off. So the test should give us the first real answers, and I'll be covering everything that comes out once players finally get their hands on the game. I'd also like to hear where you stand after everything we've talked about. Have the newer gameplay reveals changed your opinion, or are you still waiting to see how the test goes before making up your mind? Let me know down below. I think that's all from me for now, so just remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.